Well, thank you very much, Patrick Mason, for bringing me here. And I also would like to express my thanks to the team. I could see all the behind the scene work that was done uh, from plane tickets to making sure that we're fed here. Thank you very much for that. Coming to Mormon studies through the discipline of American religious history, it is probably a form of denial on my part to have titled my paper after Durkheim rather than Voltaire or Tocqueville. Voltaire was the first Frenchman to have developed an interest in religion in the early colonies, writing in his philosophical letters that William Penn had enacted, quote, very wise laws in Pennsylvania, the first being, quote, not to molest anyone on account of his religion. And you know that Tocqueville fully understood the vital role of a religion in American democracy. Contrastingly, Durkheim's interest in the United States was through a limited look at native practices in support of his study of religious life and the systematization of sociology. But they are also the ones that established him as an authority and the unquestionable authority of that discipline in France. Contemporary Mormon studies in France is Durkheimian in my view, because Durkheim is certainly the one whose teachings and methods have influenced the most religious studies in France. I do not ignore the existence of other sociologists, but I don't think I'm totally biased in that. But there is also a pre-Durkheimian era in French Mormon studies. And speaking about it now, we'll actually update a chapter that I have contributed to the subject in a volume that has yet to be published. But I am very proud as a French scholar to report that the roots of Mormon studies in France really run deep. I will illustrate this in how French scholars progressively conformed to a Durkheimian model in their study of Mormonism, and how you have in France what is presumably the longest and richest tradition of Mormon studies outside of the United States. Someone will have to disprove me on that. The final part of this presentation will be devoted to remarks on the future of this subfield. Élisée Reclus, or Alfred Maury, or Jules Rémy, who wrote specifically on Mormonism and preceded Durkheim, would have been better choices yet for my title. So Alfred Maury was a multidisciplinary scholar who introduced Mormonism in academia, in French academia, as early as 1853, with religious sects in the 19th century, the Arvinians and the Latter-day Saints, the Saints of the Latter Days, actually. Christian Ovar, who authored the most comprehensive dissertation on Francophone Mormons in Europe, rightly argues that Maury's work is, quote, one of the best and the most accurate analyses ever published on Mormonism in France, even to the present. And I'll leave the rest of the quote for you here. As Eva points out, Maury does use some epithets, but he also shows genuine interest in the Mormons, the expansion of the religion into Europe, and in its future in the U.S. That's the second part towards the end here of the quotation, where it says, where I say, in spite of epithets, okay, he in particular says, whatever the choice, that is the choice of the Mormons in face of fear of being absorbed into American society, he believed that it was of their spirit, of their perseverance, that the Mormons will have to demand success. After Maury, actually, Jules Rémy was the second French scholar who developed an interest in Mormonism, which was published in his Voyage au Pays des Mormons, which was also published in French. Rémy had the credential as a naturalist to observe Mormon adherents and dissect the new religion in ways consistent with expectations created by the quality of the writings of Voltaire, Tocqueville or of Maury, specifically on Mormonism. The fact that Rémy was trained in France's prestigious École Normale Supérieure actually heightens expectations. The book gives a very interesting insight into Mormon life in 19th century Utah, and also into Rémy's sense of Mormonism and of its leaders and its founder. But the book also falls short of expectations on many counts. Rémy comes across in it as very unfiltered and very superficial. It is obvious, for instance, that he felt a kind of intellectual kinship with Orson and Polly P. Pratt, and that he hated Heber C. Kimball. He liked Brigham Young because he felt the Masonic brotherhood with him, and so it continues. For instance, on Mormonism, Rémy gives the impression that he was doing a very objective analysis, noticing, for instance, that it was very eclectic, but at the same time, he moves on very quickly to say that that eclecticism, okay, was in fact, quote, in the intent that towers and clarifies the doctrine, whereas in practice, it was merely a gross syncretism, a disorderly amalgamation of all kinds of superstitions, all sorts of doctrines taken from the most diverse religions and systems. And it doesn't actually substantiate anything in that. So it's very superficial. He states it, and you have to deal with it. Like Maury, Alfred Maury, Élisée Reclus' Mormonism, okay, which was also published in a very prestigious review called Revue des Deux Mondes. But when you read, for instance, quote, true to the real scientific method, etc., without preconceived ideas and without taking sides, you would come away with the impression that Reclus was talking about Maury. But in fact, he was praising Rémy, whom he quotes extensively. His article is, by and large, the kind of material true scholars, Mormons or not, would shun, except for comparative purposes. For instance, to see how views have changed over generations, but that anti-Mormons, for instance, would enjoy quoting. His articles also closes the pre-Durkheimian days of Mormon studies in France. And at that point, with the three publications, what one can note is a sort of high and low in terms of quality. Maury sets a high standard that Reclus and Rémy failed to follow. We can turn to, for instance, the days of Durkheim for a better quality of study of Mormonism. And that comes with Jean Finot, a contemporary of Durkheim. He comes down to us actually with a chapter titled The Latter-day Saints or Revival of the Mormons, published in a book titled Saints Initiated and Modern Possessed, which came out in 1918. A sociologist, Finot was known for his crusade against alcoholism, but he doesn't talk about the word of wisdom, and racialism. And as the editor, he was also known for the editor of a famous review. His were also the days when science was supposed to have made religion obsolete. We'll come down to secularism here. A free thinker, he himself had become dissatisfied with religion, which he calls mirages. But he also challenges Weber's disenchantment thesis. Yes, he challenges Weber's thesis, considering that, in fact, the state had become secularized, but at the same time, people were still interested in religion, and that you still had lots of religious groups that were developing all over the place. And you have something similar that is happening right now in France, where we're talking a lot about laïcité, but you also have programs like God Changes in Paris, which shows that, in fact, you do have people who are still believers, or who still have a connection to religion or forms of spirituality. So back to my presentation. The preface and contents of Saints and Initiated shows that Finot was, like Durkheim, interested in the social function of religion, in how religion makes sense in the lives of believers. He argues that there was a sane and wholesome faith, which could be understood only, quote, by studying the small religions and their members. End of quote. There lies his interest, actually, in Mormonism. Skipping doctrine to focus on practice, he presents Mormonism as an egalitarian religion, and its founders and prophets as proletariat people who wanted to not only to enrich themselves, but also those who would join in their enterprise. He compares Mormonism to French socialist groups like Fourierism, Icarianism, but he extols the efficiency and durability of the Mormon system. In particular, you have the last quote on this PowerPoint here. I'll just read the last two lines in which he says, the Church of the Latter-day Saints combines in such conditions, after having explained everything, the social and economic advantages of both individual and collective labor. And this is where Mormonism, for him, becomes very interesting a phenomenon for sociologists. For him, actually, the Mormon past, Mormonism was actually the religion that had found the way to make communism work like a well-oiled machine by striking a balance between normally competing individual propensities to collective, 3, religious, and 4, patriotic interests, to bring all of that together into one. And you gather actually from his observations that the Mormon past is excellent material to verify the need for tacit or explicit social contract to turn natural individual rights, which is always a threat to the existence of a group if fully exercised, into a collective societal success. That principle, the principle behind that Mormon success, of course, is reminiscent of the Puritan initiative to bind passengers aboard the Mayflower into a compact for the general good. While Fino returned to a Morris-style, more Durkheimian approach, objective approach of Mormonism, of his study of Mormonism, George Henry Bousquet will actually take it even further. His most significant piece is The Mormons, published in 1949, in which he gives a socio-historical overview of Mormonism from Joseph Smith to settlement in Utah, where he analyzes the factors that contributed to the movement's strength and hypothesizes on its prospects. He evolves from scathing criticism of Mormonism to objective analysis. For instance, you have this quote right in front of you here, which could be considered both from a Mormon perspective and from a sociological perspective as a negative perception. That is, the Book of Mormon constitutes an indescribable hodgepodge at best, which reminds actually of Mark Twain's Roughing It. Book of Mormon is chloroform in print. Okay? To positive, actually, and even sometimes a defensive stance, actually. So positive, Bousquet declares that he was honored and happy to be counted among the many Gentiles, and he uses that in quote, who set aside, and I'm quoting him here, silly calumnies of the Mormons to give a very sincere testimony on behalf of, and he uses the word, the saints. The second positive quote, in the second positive quote, he marvels that the revelations received by a Vermont farm boy ultimately created a special civilization in the Rocky Mountains. And I was quoting here. And he insists that Mormonism in 1949 be viewed, quote, not as a sect, but as a bold attempt at creating a world religion, end of quote, similar to Christianity and Islam. For, quote again, what makes the prodigious sociological and historical interest of Mormonism is that it gives us to see before our eyes, so to speak, how a revealed religion is born and expands. Now, this is 30 years before Rodney Stark. So a Frenchman is very happy with that. And of course, before Thomas Oddy's Mormonism and the Avoidance of Sectarian Stagnation. Bousquet's ability to see Mormonism for what it was and still is what led me to think of him and successive French students of Mormonism as heir to a Durkheimian tradition. The tradition actually picked up from Bousquet and continued up to today. Since I am running out of time, I thought I would compile some of the works that have been done on Mormonism in France, beginning in 1971. Here you have 73 because I have three different types of works. Here you have the master's thesis completed actually in Bordeaux. Most of the works were completed in Bordeaux, including mine. And you actually also have works completed in France. And again, all of them have been done mostly by non-Mormons, but you also have Mormons in there, like Christian Offray, who is definitely an authority on Mormon studies in France. And you have the dissertations, 8 PhD dissertations to date. From those dissertations, in particular, you have Jacques Schuller, who completed the first dissertation in 1978. He picks up from where Bousquet had left and declares that Mormonism is a utopia, but at the same time, because of what Mormons actually would call continuing revelation, Mormonism avoids the perils that beset utopian groups and is able to move not only doctrinally, but also in space to adapt itself. Sophie-Hélène Trigeau, who has also written a dissertation on Mormonism, which was published by a university press, okay, is also one of the most valuable work we have on Mormon studies in France. Hers is second to none, I would say, in terms of social study of Mormonism. And the corpus of French Mormon studies is large and could have been much larger than that had there not been obstacles, hurdles in the way. Okay, so some of the research that were started actually have been abandoned, and some of the reasons to that is not only Mormonism. Okay. Part of it is because of access to contents. Of course, the internet has changed that a lot, but there are still a lot of obstacles in the way for a researcher writing a dissertation, even on Francophone Mormons and in France, because at some point you have to travel and you have to publicize your work through conferences. And those are the points that usually come with high expenses, financially, for those scholars. But financial obstacles should not give the impression that the future of Mormon studies in France is bleak. In fact, like everywhere else, it is very promising. That future is made of growing demands that I have noticed when I was a blogger and also when I was doing research on how Francophone Mormons were interacting with non-Mormons. I have seen that interest in questions that I am asked very often by journalists who have changed their approach to the way in terms of how they present Mormonism. Even journalists from competing newspapers that represent competing religious groups, like famous newspaper in France called La Croix, the Cross. They are very good friends. I have developed very interesting relations with them. Whenever they have questions about the church, they often turn towards me or towards my former PhD supervisor and mentor, Bernadette Rigel-Salar, to find out what it really is about. And that interest has also come from academia, from colleagues who've invited me to speak in conferences about Mormonism, the similarities between Mormonism and other religious groups, or philosophical groups like the Masons. So this continued interest in Mormonism needs to be accompanied, and it will necessarily imply efforts on the part of French Mormons, some of them not being accustomed to be the object of scrutiny and to see their faith intellectualized. Yet they would embrace it if only they knew that such scrutiny is overall very beneficial to their religion, since it also fulfills their scripture by bringing Mormonism out of obscurity and out of darkness. Thank you.